People are here. So welcome everyone. I think you've all been here before, so I don't really need to give an introduction to the seminar series. I do want to mention that after the last 2 weeks when I announced the seminar for next week had changed, next week's now going to be canceled and that speaker's back to presenting on May 5th. I apologize for any confusion about that. I'll send out an email next week saying that that is canceled. And there is a faculty recruit actually giving a seminar at 1 o'clock next Thursday, so it sort of frees everyone up to go attend that, hopefully, even though it's a slightly different time. The sign-in sheet, I think everyone was actually really good for the most part about signing in, but if you haven't, we will pass it around for anyone who hasn't signed in yet. We appreciate your signing in, helps with the pizza. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Kevin He. He is from Department of Biostatistics in School of Public Health, and he's going to talk to us today about variable selection for survival analysis.
Thanks, Marcy, for the kind introduction. I will talk about variable selection in survival analysis. We know that high-dimensional datasets arise rapidly in biomedical studies. For some of the diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, we have a very strong signal. Univariate marginal test is good enough to identify such strong marginal effect. But for many other diseases, such as cancer, the disease is complex. Certain subset of genetic variants may interact with each other. Marginally maybe not so significant, but jointly may be informative. So my focus will focus on this kind of analysis. So first, I want to show a relatively simple example to show the idea why we need joint modeling. For example, this is based on simulation data set, and we have two types of outcome. And it's binary classification problem. And for the outcome, we either labeled as dots or we labeled as triangle. And we have two variables. And if we study the marginal association between the outcome and the x1, we can see for x1 on the horizontal axis, the mean of this variable between these two groups are different. If we do marginal test, we can identify this variable as significant. It's very likely we identify this variable. But for another variable, for x2, we can see marginally the mean of this x2 among these two groups are very similar to each other. That's why marginally, usually, we will fail to identify this variable. Although jointly, it's very clear. Jointly, this x2 is informative. Combined with the x1 together, we can classify the outcomes. That's an example why univariate analysis is useful in some applications, but in many other applications, we need a joint modeling. Then another example, this one came from a real data set. We have more than 2,000 SNPs from 15 pathways. If we draw the heat map, the correlation plot for these SNPs, clearly we can see a block structure. The SNPs are highly correlated within blocks, but less correlated. The SNPs are highly correlated within blocks, but less correlated between blocks. Again, if we only do marginal tests, we totally ignore this correlation structure. But then how to handle this correlation structure? Because we have highly correlated structure. And how to handle this block structure is interesting. It's also a challenging problem. So I will focus on one special type of data set called censored time to event data. For example, we have time to death, the start from a cancer to death, or maybe time to onset of a disease, or length of stay in a hospital, or even time to finish a PTD dissertation. For example, my best friend took 1 year less than me to complete the PTD dissertation. But at least I'm glad I'm not censored, because what means censored? That means if the patient drops from the study, then we do not know what happened after that time point. We call it a censored data set. I will use a figure to show the typical time to event data structure. For this one, the left vertical line is the time when the study opened, and the right vertical line is when the study closed. For example, if we study 2015 transplant patient, then the start point will be the beginning of 2015, and the end time point will be the end of the 2015. And different patients may enter the study at a different time point. For example, different patients may took transplantation during different time of 2015. That's why for the horizontal line represent a different patient record, and we can see different patients, they enter the study at a different time point. And for the first two patients, they died during 2015. then we labeled as X. We observe event for these two patients. But for the third patient, this patient survived at the end of 2015. We don't know what happened after that. That's why we call it censored. But at least we know this patient lived very long during 2015. So in contrast, this patient, it dropped out from the study very quickly after this patient entered the study. Then we only observe very short period, and we don't know what happened after that. We cannot just simply drop this observation. We lost information, and also it may give us bias estimation. If we don't know censored outcome, then the problem is not that difficult. We can treat the time as continuous outcome. We can use linear regression. The difficulty just came from this censored. It's kind of a missing problem. We do not observe what happened after that. So to introduce our method, I have to introduce some notation for survival analysis. We use DI to represent the time from disease to death, and the CI is the censoring time. I is the index for patient, N is the total number of patients. So remember, for those patients who died before they censored, we only observe DI, we never observe CI. And for those patients who censored before they die, we only observe CI, we never observe DI. That's why in practice, what we observe, the observed event time is the minimum of DI and CI. And also we have an indicator whether the patient died or not. That's why when we run a survival analysis, if you use R or if you use SAS, the outcome include the two parts, right? One column will be the time, another column will be the event indicator. And then here, X is just a p-dimensional covariate vector. So to handle the survival analysis, the most famous model is called Cox proportional hazard model. So the hazard function is kind of tradition in survival analysis. We use hazard function to describe the distribution instead of a density function. So for Cox model, we assume the hazard function involves two parts. One part is called lambda 0t. We call it the baseline hazard function. It's a non-parametric. We assume all the patients in the study share the same baseline hazard function. All the patients will be the same, but the hazard function changes with time. The other part is the variable part, is the exponential x transpose time beta part. That's the parametric part. That's why together it's a semi-parametric model. And we also assume this beta is constant over time. We do not assume this beta also changes with time. That's why we call it proportional hazard. We just assume the hazard is the same, is proportional over time. That's a simple assumption. Later I will show in some cases this assumption will fail. And to estimate this Cox model, people use the so-called log partial likelihood function. It's defined by this formula. I want to mention that here, this formula can tell us why the survival analysis is a more difficult problem compared to, for example, linear regression and the generalized linear regression. So remember, for linear regression, for example, the square loss function can be written as the summation of IID case. That means each patient likelihood component only depends on that patient variable. But at here we can see in this formula, even for the X patient, the first part is okay, only involve Xi. But for the second term, it's much more complicated. Even we evaluated the X patient, we need the information from other patients. We call it the at-risk set. For example, Ri is defined as all the patients with event larger than or greater than Ti. Let's make the computation and the estimation more complicated. Next slide, I will show why it will cause a problem, especially in low-dimensional setting, doesn't matter, but in high-dimensional setting, for example, if we try Gâteaux, that one will cause some problem. And our goal is to select a subset of variable, because when we have high-dimensional variable, usually we do not assume all the variable are correlated with outcome. We only want to identify a small subset. So our goal is just to identify this small subset. Okay, so this one is the because Gâteaux is so famous, right? It's I1 penalized estimation. That's the for example, that's the idea for Gâteaux in Cox survival model. We want to maximize this partial likelihood, log partial likelihood function, but with this penalty term. And we know that for linear regression, Gâteaux is relatively simple. We even have closed form solution. But for GLM, for generalized linear regression model, we do not have a closed form solution. But we can transform the problem back to a linear regression. The idea is they call the penalized related least square approach. What they do first, they define this eta as the X transpose multiplied by the term. Then they calculated the gradient and the Hessian matrix of your log likelihood function. Then after that, through, for example, a second term Taylor expansion, our original log likelihood function can be written as a quadratic term. And the key is that this term is the Hessian matrix. In generalized linear regression model, as I mentioned, the likelihood can be written as a summation of IID case. That's why if we calculate the second derivative, the Hessian matrix will be diagonal. That's why it's very easy to solve a generalized linear regression, even we have a high-dimensional problem. We can just use the idea for linear regression. We just treat this one as weight. Then we transform the problem back to a linear regression problem, although we need an iteration for generalized linear regression. But for Cox model, it's more complicated. More complicated is because it cannot be written as a summation of IID case. We have the actual term. This term is complicated. It's at risk set. When the sample size is very large, this one will be this set will also be very large. That's why the Hessian matrix under here is not diagonal. If we solve this quadratic function, we need to inverse maybe the very large Hessian matrix. That's the problem came from. For example, some software they use class T decomposition to solve the lasso problem for survival analysis. That one works when the number of variables is not very high. And some software, for example, R package Penalized, they use some Newton-Raphson and plus some gradient Urshan idea. Then if the number of patients is not very large, still is okay. But as the number of variables and the number of sample size increase, that package can be very slow. And GlibNet uses a relatively simple idea. They ignore the off-diagonal element. They only keep the diagonal element. It's a simple approximation. And they give some ad hoc justification why that one work. Maybe the diagonal element dominate the off-diagonal element. But still, it's a simple approximation. Whether it's good or not, in some cases, maybe it's okay. But in more common cases, whether it works or not is a problem. And also, so far, I only talk about the most simple case, the Cox regression case. In survival analysis, sometimes we have more complicated data structure. For example, when we have pathway information, we will have group structure. Then how to handle those kind of structure. Group lasso and the sparse group lasso may work well for linear regression. But for Cox model, even with several thousand variables, sometimes the R package may fail for group lasso problem. Then to address this problem, we consider another method called boosting. So boosting was originally introduced in the field of machine learning to classify binary outcome. It's known as the best of the chef classifier in the world. This claim was made many years ago, 1998. Now, random forest is also very good. Different people may have different opinions. Some people may prefer random forest. And later, so people generalized the boosting idea to general loss function. They proposed the so-called gradient boosting. Then it makes boosting much more popular because we can use boosting to solve general regression problem. And for Cox model, 1999, the Ridgeway developed a gradient boosting algorithm for Cox regression model. The idea is that, for example, at each step, given the current estimation of beta, they compute the gradient of the log partial likelihood with respect to eta. This part is similar to the lasso, right? Lasso calculates the gradient and calculates the Hessian matrix. And for boosting, they only calculate the gradient. And this gradient, because it's with respect to eta I, that's why each patient will have a gradient value. So this gradient at the end will be a vector. It's n. If we have n patient, it will be n by 1 vector. And each patient will have this ui. Then people treat this ui as working response, or some people call it pseudo response. Again, the idea is that although the original problem is nonlinear, it's a Cox model, but they transform the problem back to a linear regression problem. They just treat this UI as their response outcome. Then after that, they fit a linear regression model. At each iteration, they fit a linear regression model. Although together it's a nonlinear problem, but at each iteration, they transform the problem back to a linear regression problem. And for boosting, after they calculated this pseudo response, they fit a component-wise model. That means for each variable, they fit the univariate linear regression model, and they calculated the coefficient for each variable. After they calculate all the coefficients, they choose the optimal component. Optimal component is defined as which component minimizes the least square loss function, then they choose that component. And boosting only update one component. That's different than lasso. For lasso, if we have coordinate descent at each iteration, we will cyclically update all the components, all the variable. But for boosting, at each step, only one variable is updated. It has its advantage. For example, it's known as the more robust to overfitting. But on the other hand, it will take more time to compute the boosting algorithm. Some people call it slow learner because boosting may take a very long time to convert or something like that. Then we iterated until some stopping iteration. For example, we can use cross-validation to select when to stop boosting. Because for lasso, the lambda before the penalty is the tuning parameter. But for boosting, when to stop is the tuning parameter for boosting. Because all the beta will start from 0. And if some variables are selected, they will be updated. And select how many variables totally determined by how many stop, how many iterations we want to perform for boosting algorithm. Then our goal is that we already have a boosting method. Why we want to propose a new method? Our first goal is to improve the computation efficiency. Our second goal is want to control the false positive. And our last goal is want to accommodate complex data structure. So by the way, if you look at the form of this UI, this pseudo response, you may find that it's very complicated. For example, we have for the S patient, we have an index L. The L is the at-risk set for the I belongs to the at-risk set of L. That means to evaluate the S patient, because the S patient may belong to the at-risk set of other patients. That's why we need not only consider the S patient, we also need to consider those kind of patients that belong to the at-risk of this kind of patient. Then for each S patient, we also need to consider the patient belong to the at-risk set of S patient. Sorry, I mean, and here is not a typo. We have several index here, but it's just a little complicated to calculate this formula. That's why we want to improve the computation efficiency. After we introduce the new algorithm, you will see it's relatively clear compared to this algorithm. So our proposed method, we call it, is a variant of component-wise gradient boosting. So again, at the initial step, we assign all the beta equal to 0, and we iterate the following step. For each component, we compute the component-wise gradient. Remember, previous gradient is with respect to eta I. For each subject, we will have eta I value. We calculate the gradient with respect to eta I. But this time, it's more like the low-dimensional setting. It's like the score function. We calculate the gradient with respect to each individual covariate parameter, the least beta j. And then we rank the absolute value of this gradient value. Then the optimal component is selected by this criteria. And at each step, again, we only update one variable. And we update, for example, the J star we choose from this criteria. And to update this parameter, we can use one-step Newton-Raphson update to calculate the optimal parameter at here. Remember, Newton-Raphson usually we need the Hessian matrix is p by p dimensional and the gradient is p dimensional. But for this one, we only calculate this coefficient for this optimal element. That's why at here, the second derivative is a scalar. It's easier to calculate. Not like previous, we have p by p dimensional matrix. And here we only calculate one scalar. And then we iterate until some stopping iterations. So again, at each boosting iteration, only one component of beta is selected and updated. It will facilitate variable selection. It's desirable when the number of predictors is very high, and boosting is known is more resistant to overfitting. So next, I will talk about some connection with the traditional gradient method. So again, the traditional method will first compute the working response, and then feed the working response to its covariate by least square algorithm. And our method instead, we calculate the gradient with respect to its beta j, and it avoids the calculation of working response. So in this simple Cox model case, this difference is not that important. No matter we use which algorithm, it will give us a similar result. The reason for that is because under the chain rule of differentiation, if we fit if we use the first algorithm, we fix the least square problem. We want to minimize this criteria. It's the same as we want to maximize the gradient. These two are equivalent to each other. That's why in the simple Cox model case, doesn't matter too much. Maybe our proposed algorithm will improve the speed a little bit, but it doesn't matter too much. The problem came from more complicated setting. Later I will show for more complicated setting, we have trouble to use this pseudo response. We may not always available to use this pseudo response. That will cause difference. And another advantage for our proposed method is that it's more clear to build a connection with some existing algorithm. For example, we can borrow the idea from the minimization and the maximization, the so-called MM algorithm. We can use the MM algorithm to help us to understand why boosting works. Because boosting is kind of at each step only update one component. Why this kind of algorithm work? So this MM algorithm can help us to understand this point. So the idea for MM algorithm can be, I hope this figure can help me to explain the idea. So the solid piecewise linear line is the original objective function. So the situation is that sometimes the objective function maybe is very difficult to optimize. Then how to solve the problem? MM can be helpful is that suppose we can find a surrogate function. For the surrogate function, that means at the current iteration of estimation, the surrogate function has the same value as our original objective function. And this surrogate function is a global upper bound for our original objective function. And if our original objective function is convex or concave, then we do not need to minimize the original objective function because we may not have closed form. Maybe it's difficult to minimize that objective function. But the surrogate function usually is relatively simple. It's just a quadratic term. We know for quadratic function, we can calculate the closed form for the minimizer, right? We can just calculate Newton-Raphson. One step Newton-Raphson is good enough. We can directly find the minimizer. And the idea is that at each step, instead of minimize or monotonely decrease the original objective function, we just minimize or monotonely decrease the surrogate function. If the original objective function has a good property, this algorithm can guarantee at the end we can achieve the optimal value for the original objective function. That's the idea for this MM algorithm. It can be very helpful in some situations. For example, in boosting situation, our original log path likelihood function is a joint model, involve many parameters. It's hard to optimize such kind of problem. Then boosting, the idea is that at its boosting iteration, we only work on univariate model. The why this idea works is because, in fact, the summation of all those univariate likelihood function can be considered as a surrogate function of our original log path likelihood. Because our original log path likelihood is a concave function. Through a Jensen inequality, we can find a lower bound for our original function. That's why at each step, instead of working on our original objective function, we work on those component-wise likelihood function. The idea is similar to coordinate descent. That's the idea why, for example, boosting algorithm work. And I forgot to mention, at each step of boosting, after we fit the component-wise bit, we do not directly use that bit. We use a very small learning rate. I forgot to mention, we call it V. That's a very small learning rate. People usually choose a very small value, for example, 0.01 or something like that. So this algorithm also can help us to understand the role of that learning rate. Because through this Jensen inequality, this alpha j need to be some value between 0 and 1. And at each boosting iteration, instead of maximize the surrogate function, we only need to monotonely increase the surrogate function. If that learning rate is very large, we cannot guarantee we monotonely increase the surrogate function. That's why a small learning rate is helpful for boosting procedure. Then our next step is, for example, after we fit a boosting procedure, how to control the false positive. The figure is taken from the paper by this author from 2010. It's a very famous paper for stability selection. This figure is the solution path. On the vertical line is the coefficient, and the horizontal line will change the tuning parameter. For example, for lasso, we have the lambda before the penalty term. And for boosting, the tuning parameter is just the iteration. So as we increase, maybe for lasso case, as we decrease the tuning parameter, we can say if we choose very large tuning parameter, then all the coefficient will be penalized to 0. If we choose lambda equal to 0, then all the coefficient will be the same as we fit a low dimensional regression setting. That's why the coefficient change over the tuning parameter. And the red curve is the true signal. It's based on simulation data set. The red curve is true signal. We know they are true signal correlated with outcome. And the black dashed curve are noise variable. We know they have no relationship with outcome. But we can see some of the noise variable covered the true signal. That's a typical problem for both boosting and the lasso. First, it's hard to choose an optimal tuning parameter. We need some cross-validation. Even when we use cross-validation, maybe the resic function is not sensitive to the tuning parameter. That's why it's hard to choose optimal tuning parameter. And even when we choose optimal tuning parameter, we still have trouble to separate the true signal with our noise variable. Because by randomness, in biomedical data, the randomness usually is large. By randomness, we may identify a lot of false positive. Later, I will show some simulation to show this point. And the idea for stability selection is that they just randomly draw subsamples, and on each subsample, they repeat the variable selection procedure. The idea is to identify variables that are included in the model with high probability when a variable selection procedure is performed on random sample. That means on one data set, maybe based on randomness, we can some noise variable, maybe the estimation appear to be high. We identify some false positive. But if we repeat on many subsamples, different noise variable will appear on different subsample. Only those true signal on average, the select frequency still is very high. But for those noise variable, although on one data set can be selected, but if we repeat many times, the select frequency will be low. It's better, it will help us to separate the true signal with the noise variable. And suppose we repeat B times, and for each variable, we calculate the select frequency. Suppose we repeat B times, and for each time, we can record which variable is selected. At the end, we calculate the frequency that each variable belongs to the selected subset. Then this select frequency, in fact, is the measure we will use to determine which variable is important or not. For example, we can choose a threshold, and the final selected set will be determined by all the variables with selected frequency larger than or equal to this threshold. Again, this figure came from this paper. The left figure is the original figure for solution path for lasso, and the right figure is for the selection path. The vertical line this time is the select frequency. We still vary the tuning parameter, and we record the select frequency for each variable. Then it's more clear we can separate the true signal with the noise variable. That's the first advantage. Remember, previously we have trouble to separate them, but this time, on average, only those true signal select frequency is high. Those noise variable, the select frequency is low. And another advantage is that, as I mentioned, for variable selection problem, it's hard to determine the tuning parameter. But for stability selection, the advantage is that tuning parameter is not that important at here. For example, we can vary the tuning parameter, still the trend is similar to each other. That's the advantage. We do not, for example, for lasso or boosting, for boosting algorithm, the stopping iteration is not that important. We can, for example, choose some suitable tuning parameter and just perform this stability selection. Then based on this select frequency, we can answer the question which variable is important or not. By the way, then the problem is that for stability selection, although the original tuning parameter is not that important, then another tuning parameter appears the threshold. How to determine which threshold is important? It's a key question for stability selection. But in fact, that's not a disadvantage. Although we have a new tuning parameter, in fact, that's another advantage for stability selection, because we can connect this threshold with false positive control. We can calculate the p-value or FDR for each variable. That's another advantage. Because for high dimensional problem, you may know that it's hard to draw inference. Although some people propose some method for linear regression setting, how to calculate the post-selection inference, but usually it's a hard problem. It's still it's still open problem. It's unsolved problem. But for stability selection, it's relatively easy to calculate the p-value. The idea is that remember when we repeat many times, either each times we draw a subsample to perform the variable selection. For example, I use I1 to represent the subsample I used to perform the variable selection. I have another half of data set. I can use another half of data set to fit a low-dimensional model. For example, I can select a subset of variable using the first half data set. Then because usually this set of variable, the dimensional is not that high, I can fit a low-dimensional model using the second half of data set. I can calculate the p-value for those selected variable using the second half data set. Then because it's still a multiple testing problem, that's why I can calculate an adjusted p-value. I think the original paper proposed a Bonferroni correction to calculate this adjusted value, but it will be very conservative. For example, we try on some real data set, especially for survival data set, the signal is not that strong. I think for genome value association study, if the outcome is binary, if the outcome is disease status, very often we have very strong signal. But if the outcome is a survival outcome, because survival time usually is hard to predict. That's why the signal is not that strong. If we use this kind of Bonferroni correction, we may fail to identify the signal. That's why I think our group will propose some method. It's relatively simple modification. We can use hormones procedure, and also we can use the FDR control. And also, instead of working on the original p-value, we can use the permutation idea. For example, they call it the significance analysis of microarray. We just permutate the response variable and the predictor. And under that situation, we want to mimic the situation that there's no signal at all. And then for each variable on this permutated data set, we can still calculate the select frequency for each of the variable. Then we compare the original select frequency with those permutation-based select frequency. We can control false positive and determine the threshold. So some simulation study. So this figure, we try different simulation setting. We increase, for example, the first column is the correlation. So we for different setting, we increase the magnitude of the correlation. And we try different measures. The first one is a univariate test based on Bonferroni correction. The second one is a univariate test based on FDR control. And the third one is the Lasso. The fourth one is the boosting algorithm. The last one is the boosting with stability selection. Then we can see this column is number of false positive. This one is the proportion of false positive. This one is number of false negative. The last one, we call it power. It's the empirical proportion that we identify the true signals. Then for this, when all the predictors are independent with each other, the univariate tests still perform okay. Lasso have very large false positive. It's kind of it's a well-known factor for Lasso. We may identify the selected set. Lasso, even based on some very strong assumption, they can guarantee, for example, your selected subset select the true subset, but they cannot guarantee, for example, there's no false positive. That's why for Lasso, usually we have a large number of false positive. For boosting, in terms of false negative, the performance is very similar to Lasso. That's not a surprise because boosting has close connection with Lasso procedure. And in terms of false positive, boosting performs much better compared to Lasso. And I think one reason is because, again, for Lasso, at each iteration, they use collinear addition. They will try to update all the components. But for boosting, we do ranking. At each iteration, we select the most important variable. And we do not update all the variables. We only update the selected most important variable. That's why in terms of false positive, boosting perform better than Lasso. But we still, even we use cross-validation, we still have some false positive for boosting algorithm. And if we use stability selection, we can reduce the false positive. And as we increase the correlation structure, the univariate tests have more problem. For data application, we try it's called CM. It's a skin cancer data set. We have a total of more than 800 CM patients. More than 100 patients died during the follow-up period. And we have more than 2,000 SNPs from 15 different pathways. And first we try lasso, then lasso select 25 signals from this data set. Then we try boosting select 7 predictors. And finally, we try the stability selection. And stability selection select 3 variables from this set of variables. So here is the, we draw the select frequency for all these variables. The red line is the variable we selected. And the blue line is the a variable identified in previous study. Previous study used univariate analysis, and then they report some identified SNPs. We compare the result. We can see these 3 variables are identified. This variable, this SNP is highly correlated with one of previous reported SNP, and other 2 are relatively new identified SNPs. So I want to take some time to talk about, because at the beginning I mentioned for Cox model, there's no big difference between our proposed boosting algorithm and the previous gradient boosting algorithm. I want to talk about some, I want to use an example to illustrate the idea. For more complex data structure, there will be big difference between our proposed method and previous method. The situation called time varying effect. So as I mentioned, for Cox model, we assume the beta, the hazard function, is proportional over time, but that may not be true in practice. The left figure is for transplantation patient. The horizontal line is the time after transplantation. The vertical line is the coefficient. That's the log hazard ratio. So if coefficient is negative, that means hazard ratio is less than 1. That means it's a protective factor. If the coefficient is larger than 0, the hazard ratio is larger than 1. That's a risk factor. And for this variable, it's called source muscle. It's a muscle on the back of a human being. And if we fit a Cox model, if we assume proportional hazard model, then this variable is not significant. Maybe it's on the boundary, it's not very significant. But if we fit a time varying effect model, then it's very clear this variable is a very strong protective effect in the early several days. That means patient with strong source muscle has a higher chance to survive the transplant procedure. And in fact, this variable not only is significant, this variable dominates the prediction. It's a very important variable. Human with a strong source muscle has a much higher chance to survive the transplant procedure. But just after several days, the effect disappears. Right? In the long run, in the long run, muscle doesn't matter. Women live longer than men, right? Muscle doesn't matter. And the second figure is for the kidney dialysis patient. We have 2 treatment options for the dialysis patient. One called HD, another one called PD. HD is the default treatment option in the United States, and PD is more popular in countries such as Canada, Hong Kong, and Japan. And there are big debates which treatment option is the best. Some medical doctors in the United States claim that PD is the 3rd class treatment option recommended by the 3rd class medical doctors, because there are big debates between these 2 methods, which one is better. And if we fit a time varying effect, then the trend is very clear. We code PD as 0, code HD as 1. We compare HD to PD. Then it's very clear we have a peak for the mortality in the first several weeks. So that means in the early stage, HD has a higher mortality. It's a risk. HD patient may die more quickly compared to PD. Because HD patient, the pressure for the heart is very large in the first several weeks. Many patients will die due to that problem, and also many patients may die due to infection. But this relationship will switch up between 1 year and 2 years. That means in the long run, HD still is a better option compared to PD. After 1 year or 2 years, the relationship switch. PD will have a higher mortality compared to HD. If we fit a Cox model, depending on how many years you want to follow up, you may get a controversial result. But if you fit a time varying effect model, then it's very clear what's the trend. And what I know is that for lung cancer, it's known we have some genetic variant has this kind of time varying effect. So some certain time patient maybe, some treatment has effect, or some drug has effect in early time period, but the effect disappear for certain subgroup of patient. Then to handle this time varying effect, the likelihood function is very similar to before. The only difference, instead of constant beta, this time we use a function, beta change with time. That's why we call the time varying effect, just the effect changing with time. And to estimate this time varying effect, we use a B spline to estimate this time varying effect. For example, this beta JT, its component will be spanned by a B spline function multiplied some parameter. This B spline function is given, and we transform the problem for each component of variable. We have a set of parameters. For example, if we choose a k-basis function, for each jth variable, we will have k parameter to represent the effect of that variable. And the difficulty is that, I mean, in linear regression, it's not a very difficult problem. In linear regression, what we do, we can use the multiplier between x and this bt as an interaction, and we estimate this state. That's why it's not a difficult problem. It's just a special case of interaction. But for Cox model, the difficulty is that time is not only our predictor. Time is our response variable. Our response variable and here is time. That's why it makes the problem much more complicated. To estimate the time varying effect, even in low-dimensional setting, is very complicated. For example, we need a rearranged data set. That means we need to order the patient. We order the patient based on the observed time point. The first patient will have the shortest observed time. That patient has only one record. Then the second patient will have two records. One record at his or her own event time. Another record at the previous patient event time. That's why we keep going. Even 5,000 patients will need a data set with record more than 12 million. That's why even in low-dimensional setting, it's a very difficult problem, not easy to solve this problem. And for the high-dimensional setting, how we select the variable is more difficult. For example, at first we just want to try the gradient boosting to solve this problem, but then we find this time the pseudo response is a function over time. You remember previous for Cox model, the gradient is a vector, it's n multiply, it's n by 1 vector. I mean the traditional gradient method. We calculated the pseudo response. For the traditional Cox model, this gradient is just a vector. We can treat that one as a pseudo response. But for time varying effect, even for the ith patient, it's a function over time. It's not just a scalar value. That's why we cannot use the traditional gradient boosting idea to solve this time varying effect. Then to solve this problem, we generalize what we proposed previously. We call it Gâteaux differential-based boosting. The idea is similar to previous algorithm. For example, to minimize a loss function, given the current value of beta, we want to find a normalized direction such that the loss function descends most rapidly. And to solve this problem, we consider the Gâteaux differential of this loss function along the updated direction. The Gâteaux differential is just in the finite dimensional case, it's just the directional derivative. Remember, in the Cox model, each variable, each parameter is a single, each variable has a single parameter. We can calculate the gradient. Its gradient is just a scalar. And for this case, it's more complicated. In the finite dimensional case, the gradient, the Gâteaux differential, maybe is a vector. And for the functional analysis case, maybe it's a non-parametric, it's more complicated. But still, we can use the idea. The idea is that we use the Gâteaux differential to rank its variable. Why we can do that is because if there is a block-wise update direction that minimizes this Gâteaux differential, then this direction would be the direction of steep descent, just based on the first order expansion. That's why we can use this block-wise Gâteaux differential to rank a different group of variables. And this Gâteaux differential in the linear regression case has a connection with the large algorithm. We know that for the linear regression case, for the last algorithm, we use the angle between our response variable and the space spanned by the variable to determine whether the variable is important or not. For example, if the outcome vector is independent, is perpendicular to this space spanned by the variable, that means the outcome has no relationship with this set of predictor. If the outcome is highly correlated with the outcome, the angle between this vector and this space will be very small. That's why large just use this kind of angle to determine which variable is important or not. And for problem outside of linear regression, we can use this Gâteaux differential to mimic this idea. We can use this Gâteaux differential as a measure to determine which group of variable is more important. Yeah. So that's final slides. I use Taiwan effect as an example to show the idea of a Gâteaux differential. But just as I mentioned, we can also use this Gâteaux differential as a measure to rank the group variable. So group lasso and sparse group lasso may have numerical problem for the survival analysis and for the more complex data structure. But we can use this Gâteaux differential to select to rank a group of variable and also select group of variable. One potential application is the pathway analysis. For example, traditionally people fit marginal text on SNP. Then they summarize the information from SNP level to the pathway level. The problem is that all those kind of ideas based on the suitability of the marginal text. If we want to fit a joint model, we can use the method we talk about. We can select the SNP. In the meantime, we also want to rank the pathway. And similarly, we can do the gene injection because gene injection can be considered as a special case of a group variable. And for gene injection, the difficulty is that the potential number of predictors is very high. That's why if you fit a group lasso, it's very likely it will fail. And also, if you want to assume some asymmetric structure, for example, if you want to assume interaction exists, if one of the main effects exists, then it's hard to fit a lasso problem. Because for lasso problem, usually we have a set parameter, then we penalize some parameter to 0. But for this asymmetric problem, we have trouble to set. It's kind of dynamic. The model is dynamic. First, we select one of the main effects, then we can select the interaction. That's why it's a dynamic problem, it's not a single optimization problem. It's hard to use lasso. Although I think Tim Shawnee recently published a paper to use lasso to solve this problem. But if you look at the penalization, you will find they use a very complicated penalization term. It's not easy to solve that problem. I guess we have trouble to use that idea for very large, for example, genetic data set. And the last problem is the analysis of a multiple phenotype problem. And if we fit a joint model with multiple phenotype, some method, we can also use a sparse group lasso for the multiple response variable. But the problem is that for that kind of method, they ignore the correlation between the response variable. We know the different multiple phenotype, they may be highly correlated with each other. This information is important for us, for example, to select a variable. And some people use the sparse canonical correlation to address this problem. But for sparse canonical correlation, it's all in and all out problem. For example, if one variable is selected important for the outcome, it's important for all the outcome. But we know in practice that may not be true. A subset of predictor may be highly correlated with certain phenotype, and another set of predictor may be highly correlated with another certain subset. That's why the existing method may have trouble to answer this question. What we propose here is helpful to answer this kind of question. Thank you. Yeah, any question? Yeah.
So cool stuff. You're building that very complicated approach using the Cox model and then updates in the unidirection and building the boosting out of it.
Yeah.
It's sounds very complicated. Whereas, did you compare that to the random survival forest approach when they just build instead of using the Cox regression, they used just a tree but adapted for the truncated survival data, and whereas it reports you the feature importances, and those can be further used to build the p-values and do the multiple testing correction, all that kind of stuff. So similar approach, but I think this was a little more complicated and was a little more work. Did you do like side-by-side comparison?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think that kind of method, as you mentioned, is based on tree-based method. Yeah. The problem we try to answer is different. And for this kind of for boosting, is more similar to a lasso problem. For example, we assume the effect of predictor is additive. And for random forest, it's tree-based method. We can identify even higher order interaction, but it's not based on additive model.
Well, you can do gradient boosting on trees too, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I hope to do, because what you know that tree-based method is very. It can be a very helpful tool for low-dimensional setting. But as your number of predictor increase, then it's hard to use a tree-based method. Some people use boosting. I think there's a paper called adaptive index model. Some people use this idea to solve the problem, but again, the current literature still can work with very low dimensional setting. We have trouble to generalize the idea to high dimensional setting. That's a very interesting research question. Our group have interest to study that question, but it is a hard question.
Yeah. Well, another advantage of random forest that you can grow those trees in parallel, right? You don't have to do the sequence of them. So if you have a server with 32 cores, you just run it on
right.
Whereas boosting has to be linear, so sequential that slows down. That's why you said it's slow linear, right? So
Right. I think, for example, for boosting, we have the so-called base procedure, and here I just use linear regression as the base procedure.
Yeah.
But if we use tree as a base procedure, then it will be exactly as what you mentioned. It will be tree-based method. And also, some people use statistical boosting. They also draw subsample, similar to random forest. Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, other question?
Thank you.
Thank you.